Right, so ever since I got back from Greece, I am currently playing catch up on all the new releases. The next one I saw was Black Phone 2. I saw this at a very late session last night. I did want to catch it in theaters though, and the reason for that is because I actually quite enjoyed the first Black Phone. When I first saw it, I was like, yeah, that was pretty solid. Some things worked, some things didn't. I rewatched it recently in anticipation for the second one, and I was kind of sitting there being like, yo, they low key cooked here. Like, this is pretty well made. It's dealing with some really exciting, conceptually heady ideas, and there's some real good child performances in that first Black Phone movie. And so I was actually really looking forward to Black Phone 2. And I cannot decide whether Black Phone 2 is a really good bad movie or a really bad good movie. It's like the ultimate 5 out of 10 for me. And I feel really mean saying that. As I was watching it, I was like, especially in the first 30 minutes, I thought they were really cooking. There was this great escalation of the characters from that first movie. We catch up with Finney and he's now a lot gruffer. He's a lot angrier. He's grown up. You know, that first movie ended with this moment where he gets back to class and he now goes by a different name and he's carrying himself differently. And it's this like almost sad suggestion that like trauma changes people. You know, what he's been through, it seems like a good thing in his eyes, but it's actually not. You know, he's like lost that innocence way too early. And in the second one, they double down on that theme. You know, he's like beating kids up and he's constantly having to self-medicate with drugs. And it's a really dark existence for the character of Finney. And in this section, I was like, wow, this movie is going to be excellent. On top of that, we catch up with Gwen, his sister, and we are now escalating these visions she's having and these powers she has. And I thought they were really cooking. I really like this bleak, dark approach, and especially for like a mainstream, big budget horror movie, a Blumhouse production, I thought the approach here was fascinating and mature. On top of that, when they start looking into this kind of string of child murders that happened at this like camp in the snow, I was actually like, okay, I can kind of see what we're doing here. We're not just doing the first Black Phone again. We're actually taking these characters that have been through something horrific and putting them in a new situation. I was like, that's a really exciting idea. You can make a whole series just of these two characters kind of investigating crimes with their different powers, right? Because they both have this supernatural touch. Finney can hear these phone calls, you know, from people that might not be in our existence anymore. And Gwen has these like surreal nightmares, visions that essentially serve as premonitions. So I was like, what a cool idea to almost have this like X-Files film series, and meanwhile you have the grabber haunting them from beyond the grave in the background. I think where this movie kind of starts to struggle though is when it tries to do both. You know, the movie kind of falls apart as it goes on because you'll jump from like really interesting character beats with Finney or with Gwen or even with their dad or their like own personal history. It'll cut from something really interesting to frankly a mystery that kind of sucks. And that's the biggest issue I had with this movie is I don't know about you guys, but I thought the mystery here was basically a non-starter. At the start of the movie, he starts having these visions of a bunch of kids that were murdered, and we're not meant to know who did it. In these visions, they're like carving initials into the ice, and we're meant to slowly figure out who it is. And it's so glaringly obvious who it is. I almost thought it was a joke. I was like, what are we doing here? On top of that, the people, the characters that are introduced because of this mystery are basically non-starter characters as well. You meet this character named Mustang who frankly just has absolutely nothing to do, as well as these like people that run the camp, and they're very boring as well and basically only there as cannon fodder for the villain. Now, Ethan Hawke is back, but dare I say there is a question mark here, all right? We never actually see his face properly. It's always covered in makeup or the mask, and I don't mind that. But I will say, is there a Mandalorian situation going on here? I know Ethan Hawke has been doing all the press, but was Ethan Hawke actually on set or was this a stunt double? Because I genuinely couldn't tell. But yeah, this movie was really difficult for me to connect with. I thought the pacing was sluggish and difficult, and you could feel it losing the crowd as it goes on. But every 5 to 10 minutes, there was also something that pricked my ears up and made me go, oh, wow, that's cool. There's all these great sections that are shot in 8mm that look great and sound great. There's some genuinely gruesome, horrific flashback stuff. So when this movie is cooking, it is actually quite engaging, but it's just all the different pieces do not come together. And in my opinion, the big issue here is, yeah, just this core mystery. I don't mind the idea of taking these characters and making them kind of like kid detectives. I actually think that's quite an exciting idea. And meanwhile, the grabbers like fuck it up for them. But it's a non-mystery. Like, you know who's done the murders, obviously, all right? Like, duh. And on top of that, yes, these are old murders that happen. They're not new ones, all right? So as a result, you're already dealing with characters that are deceased. They are no longer in peril. But what would have been a smart writing choice is to give us maybe parents of these children, parents of these victims, or family members of these victims that need closure, that need rest. Basically, the only driving force here is we need to find these bodies so then we can stop having visions, so we can stop being haunted by these premonitions. That's kind of it. And as a result, the motivation almost feels slightly self-involved and incredibly isolated and hard, in my opinion, for an audience to connect with. I just kind of think this movie fumbled all its major components. But to get into this properly, I will need to talk about spoilers. So 3, 2, 1, let's talk about spoilers for The Black Phone 2. But before we do, please consider getting a membership to this channel. For the cost of a cup of coffee a month, you get access to a weekly or fortnightly podcast where I talk about every single new movie, every single old movie, rewatches, stuff I've watched at home, stuff I've watched in the theaters, TV shows, anything like that. I talk about everything. And again, it really helps out the channel. Thank you so much for considering. Now let's talk about some spoilers. But before I do, I also just want to say, I think it would have been a really interesting idea for a sequel to have a similar setup, right? That first 30 minutes, you're following young Finney while he's like seeing visions of the grabber and he can't move past it. And then you go with the grabber is back, right? Like he's haunting these visions and haunting these kids, making phone calls from beyond the grave. And I think what would be really interesting is if he was influencing the town, influencing individual kids. He finds weak kids and corrupts them to do his bidding, and they need to investigate these crimes. And so it's like, it's an interesting, because it's kind of like new villains, new victims, maybe within the school as well, right? Like kids from the school are being corrupted and they're being weaponized against Finney, and they need to like figure this out together. And then you could have sort of, just like weaved in, like I think it would have made it for a tighter narrative and also made the whole like the grabber is back conceptually a bit more compelling. You could have even had Gwen is dealing with trying to figure this out, right, with her visions. Meanwhile, Finney is actually being corrupted, right? Like the grabber is trying to corrupt him. So maybe it starts with other kids, and then the ultimate climax is Finney going to turn? Is Finney going to lean into the dark, malevolent influences, like these supernatural influences from the grabber from beyond the grave? I think that'd be really interesting. That could have been an interesting through line for a couple movies as well, but ultimately what we got was a little strange, and I'm going to get into why now. All right, so this movie really like stretches the lore, all right? We find out, okay, the big lame twist here that isn't even a massive reveal. The grabber is obviously the one that is responsible for all these crimes against these children in this camp. Like, duh, who else are they spelling out? And, the reveal here of like, that's him. I'm just like, yeah, yep, okay, like, sure. Do you get what I mean? Like, you grew up in a town where there was a child murderer and you didn't, anyways. So that was like step one, where I was like, okay, we spent way too much time pretending this was a mystery when it wasn't. Like, no one in the audience is surprised by this. We are actually all here to see the return of the grabber. Issue number 2 is, again, like all these victims are already deceased. And on top of that, we don't particularly learn much about these individual characters through the flashbacks. They are essentially a glob of plot device. Does that make sense? Like, none of them have very distinguishable features. We don't get real informative telling flashbacks. It would have been great if we learned what these kids wanted to be, what, their hopes and admirations were. So there's something to connect with here. But frankly, it's not a very good mystery movie. And then the movie goes for broke. And we find out that one of the most interesting parts of the first movie is their abusive father, right? Finney and Gwen's abusive father. One of the best scenes of that first Black Phone movie is when Gwen drops the bottle. Harrowing stuff. So we find out that their mother self-deleted, right, in the first one. And this movie goes, actually, no, she was murdered by the grabber too. And it's a bit of a funky one, because at first I was like, okay, interesting retcon. If you do something really interesting with this, I might actually get behind it, But ultimately, it just feels a little forced and for not much emotional payoff. You get what I mean? It doesn't really change much for the characters. The dad can obviously kind of somewhat relieve himself of some guilt, but truthfully, I think it actually does take away some of the most interesting stuff in that first movie. I think what makes the first movie so interesting and tragic is this idea that Gwen is actually gifted. She has supernatural powers. She has these visions that will actually help her save people's lives. And the father is struggling with that because these same visions the mother had, and that's what drove her to insanity. So the father can't reconcile this, and it's almost this thing he wants to hurt and destroy because of the pain that it caused him, right? It's a really interesting idea. And that moment at the end of the first Black Phone where he tears up and he says, "I'm sorry, I was just scarred by what happened with the mum." It's one of the few moments in movies where an excuse is given for someone's violent behavior where I actually have some level of understanding. I'm not saying all is forgiven, but there was a sense of tragedy there when he has that breakdown. You know, you're like, Jesus, what a tortured soul. And as a result, going into Black Phone 2, you do have a bit more understanding and empathy for the father. And I don't think the twist really gives us any more of that. I think the twist was undercooked. And I think so much time is spent with threads that aren't really that exciting and characters that are ultimately just cannon fodder for the grabber, that the movie doesn't really have a great amount of time to really cook and develop this reveal. You know, it's ultimately a bit shallow and frankly feels like it was just thrown in there to be like, surprise. On top of that, it just feels a little like, you know, you can feel the strings being pulled. It's like the grabber has a very specific way of disposing of people and disposing of bodies normally, but in this situation, he's like, I'm gonna sneak you down and stage a self-deletion for your husband to walk in on. It's like, sure, you know what I mean? Like, my impression of the grabber was he was a bit calculated. He also gave very clear child predator insinuations, but it felt like he had a bit of a ritual. And in the first movie, that was broken and shattered as he kind of became more unhinged. And it just felt like they were kind of making up the law as they went on in this movie, frankly. And, you know, like then it just gets kind of batshit insane. Now, I will say I did really like all the Nightmare on Elm Street stuff in this movie. There's another way to say it, right? This idea that he is only there in their dreams, but when he's in these dreams, when he's in Gwen's visions, he can actually impact the real world. So he'll start strangling Gwen in her vision, in the dream, whatever you want to call it, and then she'll start being strangled in real life. You have like full-on Nightmare on Elm Street sequences where she's like flying up and down a room and people can feel him and attack him. All that stuff's really exciting. And I've always appreciated about both Black Phone movies is the way they kind of just go, yeah, there's supernatural aspects in this world, deal with it. And this one goes a bit further and basically doubles down in a very Stephen King way. And I know the books are written by Stephen King's son, I believe. But yeah, it just goes, yes, God is real, hell is real. The grabber talks about the fact that he spent time in hell, and I actually found that pretty fascinating. And I was just sitting there being like, God, like, were there studio limitations? Did they just not have much time? Because you really could have explored some infinitely fascinating stuff. I would have gone full tilt. I would have shown the grabber in hell for a while before he figures out that he can somehow connect to this vision realm that Gwen connects to. Like, I would have had what hell looked like, what purgatory looked like for the grabber. Maybe it's just this perpetual, it's like Superman, but a hellscape where he's just watching flashbacks of him getting owned by Finney. I will say I did really like all the character stuff between Finney and Gwen. Again, I think the way they bounce off each other and the way the movie explores their dynamic and how they both have different ways of processing what they went through in the first movie. I thought all that stuff was really good. There is a very clear, again, Finney is a lot more aggressive and assertive and violent. Like, he's a violent guy, and the way he views these experiences, even when he shows up in the grabber's house, there's a moment where Gwen kind of like lucid dream walks into the grabber's dungeon and Finney's just spitting on the floor and kind of, you know, he just wants to get out of there straight away. And I really, really admired that portrayal. But at the same time, there's just so much shit in this movie where you're like, what, like, I don't know, would it have not been more interesting to have them either be, make this a multiple, like, 3 to 5 movie franchise where, yeah, we just have these kids cracking a couple cases and the grabbers trying to deal with them in the background. Or if you're going to make it this whole like conceptual, generational trauma thing with the grabber, right? The idea that he tormented the mum and tormented the daughter. You really could have lent into that into like a haunting Twin Peaks sort of existential way, right? Like the grabber was drawn to this family's energy. Like he always wanted to destroy them because they've got these gifts. They're touched by God, and he's like the opposite of that. I actually would have taken a movie where like Gwen is having flashbacks of her father, right? Maybe her and Finney still hate the father for how awful he was in the first movie, and they start having these flashbacks of everything he went through, how pure him and their mother's love actually was before she self-deleted, and then really build that reveal as to why the grabber targeted her. If you're gonna give some like retcon, like maybe make it a full retcon, give it a really engaging backstory where maybe the mother and the grabber were at the same camp and he actually fancied her and then was like, well, if I can't have you, no one can, and like took her life that way to spite him. Like give me something where it's like, okay, the melodrama's worth it, the retcon's worth it, this is fascinating, this is exciting, we're learning more about these characters. You could have had a story going on in the present, and maybe they need to go in their own subconscious, their own family line, supernaturally, right? And unpack everything that happened to them. And, then that would have made sense, the staged self-deletion and why it was designed to hurt the husband, the father, right? But as it stands, like I was just sitting there being like, yeah, you really swung for the fences with this retcon for really not much payoff, like kind of bizarre, and it does actively hurt the first movie. Ultimately, I don't think the movie reckons with Ethan Hawke / the grabbers psychology that much. And it kind of insinuated some stuff in the first one that I really appreciated. But I think for this to be a truly exceptional sequel, I really want to get into the weeds of Finney, get into the weeds of Gwen. I would have loved to actually get to know the mum as a character, learn about her hopes, her dreams, her ambitions. The movie ends on what should be a really emotionally touching moment where Gwen picks up the phone call and it's her mum on the other end and she's saying, tell Finney I love him. And he's been rejecting the calls. But like, ultimately, it's like, it's not very felt. I don't really know much about her. And all I'm sitting there thinking about is how much of a retcon a lot of this stuff is. The pacing here is egregious at times. And the payoff is just, you're watching like these Nightmare on Elm Street, these vision versions of these child victims take out a vision / dream version of the grabber. Meanwhile, Gwen has these powers and the grabbers killed these random like Christian people that you don't really care about and almost killed Damien Bashir. I think his name was Armando, right? So it's like, it's just characters that you don't really care about are in peril. And I think it's such a shame because when this movie's cooking, it is really cooking. There's this great moment where Gwen is in the phone booth and the grabber starts like strangling her. And then she starts bleeding from somewhere. I think it might have been her stomach, maybe her neck, but she starts getting spun around and it fills up the phone booth. And I'm like, yeah, like this director knows what he's doing at times. He knows how to make good sequences. He knows how to get something really eerie. These child murder flashbacks we have throughout this movie are horrific and eerie. There's some great practical makeup. It reminds me of stuff from Sinister. But at the same time, by the halfway point, you're like, wow, you've given me nothing to connect to in regards to this mystery. It just goes in circles and it brings up about 70,000 really good ideas. Like genuinely every like 5 seconds, I was like, oh, that's really exciting. Stick with that. And then it just abandoned it. And it was ultimately a really difficult, frustrating movie for me. And, it was frustrating because it ought to be better, like that's the big thing here. You got all the original cast back. I'm operating on good faith that Ethan Hawke was actually on set and that wasn't a stunt double or anything, but you've got a lot of this great cast back and they're giving it their all for a script that just kind of like goes up, down, sideways and never finds a consistent rhythm. So it's just a little frustrating. Anyways, thank you so much for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, and subscribe. Also, as I mentioned before, please consider gaining a membership to this channel. It really does help out the channel and keeps things moving. Thank you so much and have a lovely day.